All right, friends, it's time to give you loyal listeners a discount on protein powder. You may or may not know, but I launched my very first protein powder 2 years ago. It's a grass-fed beef isolate with only 3 ingredients: grass-fed beef, either organic cacao or organic vanilla, and organic monk fruit. Now, if you don't want any of the added flavor and sweeteners, you can also just get unflavored. And no matter what flavor you choose, you're getting over 23 grams of protein per scoop, which is going to keep you full and satisfied between meals. I love starting my day with a Fab4 smoothie and breaking my fast with that much protein. It makes a serious difference in my cravings and blood sugar balance the rest of the day, and I've seen it with my clients as well. Now, I never thought I'd own a product company, but when I got pregnant with Sebastian, I realized the majority of protein powders were chemically extracted or enzymatically extracted, and I wanted to use heat and water only. I wanted minimal ingredients because we don't need those emulsifiers, fillers, or added vitamins, minerals, and probiotics. All of those additions increase the chances that it's not going to work for your body, whether it be bloating, digestion issues. I just wanted pure, clean protein to keep you full and satisfied so you could build the most delicious Fab4 smoothie. And I have to say, I'm pretty proud of the flavor. If you take a look at our reviews on Amazon, you'll see 5-star reviews for flavor. And that is key, because if you don't love your Fab4 smoothie and you don't love drinking your protein powder, you're not going to do it. It won't become a habit, and it's consistency that outpaces everything. So if you're here and you're listening and you want to give our protein powder a try, use the code PODCAST5 for $5 off your order. And let me know if you love it. My favorite ways to apply this protein powder is in my Fab4 smoothie, making freezer fudge, making chocolate milk, making hot chocolate, and throwing the unflavored into all my kids' baked goods. So let me know how you use it. Let me know if you love it, and share this podcast deal with your friends.
Oftentimes, when we think about blood sugar, and including how it's taught in the curriculum, it is within the context of diabetes, which is to say blatant dysfunction so far along that things have gone really off track. In general, we have so many things in place that suggest to people that they don't need to make changes when in fact they're in the window of opportunity to make changes.
Dr. Lauren Kelley-Chew is the head of clinical product at Levels. Prior to Levels, Lauren led strategy and biz ops at Verily Life Sciences, driving product, commercial, and clinical strategy with a focus on wearables, digital biomarkers, and emerging products. She previously founded a Y Combinator-backed digital therapeutic startup for digestive diseases and worked as a private equity investor. Lauren graduated from medical school at UPenn, where she was a Gamble Scholar. Throughout her career, Lauren has been inspired to build products and businesses that solve system-level problems and make good health accessible to everyone. It's such a pleasure to welcome Dr. Lauren Kelley-Chew to the show. Lauren, it's so good to see you again. I'm so excited to have you on the podcast today. I feel like it's been a few months and we had such a fun conversation on the Levels podcast, so it felt only right to bring you on mine.
So excited to be here and to be chatting again.
I know. And now I get to ask you all the questions. So first and foremost, you work at Levels. What is Levels and what do you do?
Yeah, so Levels is a startup focused on reversing the metabolic health crisis. And so really what we're trying to do is help people to understand how their food impacts their health. It's really that simple, or it sounds simple, but it's much more complex than you would think, because the food that we eat has such a dramatic impact on the conversion into energy for our cells. And unfortunately, for the most part, to lifestyle choice. I know you talk a lot about this in your podcast. Oftentimes, this process of converting food into energy gets very disrupted. For example, from eating high sugar, high carb foods or eating really highly processed foods. And so the goal of Levels is to use biosensors like continuous glucose monitors to give people a window into seeing how their body is actually reacting to the food that they're eating. And you can also see what the impact is of exercise and sleep and stress and those kinds of things. But right now, our focus is really just on helping people get real-time feedback to understand how their food choices are linked to what's actually happening in their body.
Well, I said this on the Levels podcast when you had me on. Levels and having a CGM on myself and on clients has been an absolute game changer for me and for my clients to identify the things that really aren't working for their body, to identify when things like caffeine or stress or lack of sleep really derail their progress and their blood sugar the next day or even in that same day. And so I'm obviously pretty obsessed with having this technology. I'm so excited that you don't have to have, a diagnosis to get your hands on something like this. But I'm curious, like, why did you personally get so excited about it? Like, you're an MD. Why are you working for a tech company?
It's interesting because my journey into metabolic health actually started during medical school, but it wasn't because of information that we were learning in school. In fact, there's shockingly little information about nutrition and metabolic health taught in a traditional medical school curriculum. My journey started because I learned that I had prediabetes, which was pretty surprising to me at the time. Looking back, the puzzle pieces fit. But at the time, I was an avid runner. I'd always had a lean BMI. I was following all of the recommendations that I had learned about what to eat. And I thought I was eating in a really healthy way. But at the same time, I was eating very high carb meals. I was eating a lot of sugar. I wasn't sleeping. I was in medical school. I had very high levels of stress. And I had this entire constellation that I think impacts so many Americans. As we talked about when you were on Level's show, and as you've talked about on your various episodes, I mean, at this point, 9 out of 10 Americans has a marker of metabolic dysfunction. So this is impacting all of us. And I was certainly living that out in my life, even as I was learning how to take care of other people. So that was really the beginning where I realized that I had to take health into my own hands and to really figure out all this stuff that I wasn't learning through my education of getting an MD. And that got me on the path of trying to understand food and glycemic index and the blood sugar impact of the various things that I was eating. But I came to feel like without that window into understanding what's actually happening inside my body, there was just a ton of guesswork. And I had created this entire eating plan that I felt followed all of the recommendations, but that I would later learn actually was spiking my blood sugar, despite the fact that I was conscious of trying not to have high blood sugar at that point. And so somewhere along the way, I found Levels and I signed up for it, but I was put on the wait list. And then I kind of forgot about it and months passed. And eventually I got a text from an old med school classmate of mine who was also a colleague of mine at Verily when we both worked there and had later joined A16Z and became an investor in Levels. And he asked if I would be interested in chatting with this startup named Levels, that he thought they had a role that was perfectly tailored for me. And that name kind of rang a bell. So I checked my email and I realized that was the company I was on the wait list for. So I thought, if nothing else, maybe if I had coffee, I would get off the wait list.
And get yourself a sensor.
Exactly. And I would be able to kind of move forward in my attempts to understand my own body. So I had coffee with Sam, our CEO. And I think 3 weeks later, I had joined Levels and I did wear a CGM. It totally changed my life and my health, and have been working on it ever since. And just, I'm so excited to be now part of spreading the word about metabolic health and helping people make that link between the food they're eating and the impact on their body.
Wow. Well, taking a step back, it's surprising to me looking at all of your accolades in medical school, you being top of your class and at a really well-known medical school, UPenn, like to look at that and think like you didn't know about the glycemic index, but you were taught about type 2 diabetes. So can you unpack for me like how that went and you trying to discover and learn more about nutrition? Like where did you go? What did you rely on? And were you the one that made your diagnosis or did a doctor tell you?
So diabetes runs in my family. And so for that reason, I was doing some extra screening and I had an oral glucose tolerance test, which women might be familiar with as the test that they get during pregnancy to screen for gestational diabetes. But it's really the gold standard of trying to, or was the gold standard at the time. I think now we understand you need a lot of inputs to understand insulin resistance. But at the time I did that test mostly just as a way to say, okay, everything's fine because everyone suspected there was nothing going on. But just given the prevalence in my family, they thought that we should check. And then it checked positive to prediabetes. And like I said, that was really surprising. And to your question about what was the next step, it's interesting because I then had a follow-up appointment with a physician to discuss my prediabetes after that test. And basically the messaging to me was, yes, you meet criteria for prediabetes, but look at you. You can't possibly actually have an issue. So therefore, really just like continue doing what you're doing. Just keep going forward. You don't look like someone who really has this. And so just don't give it another thought. You're in medical school, you're stressed, just move on. And that didn't really sit well with me, but I think it reflected at the time, and unfortunately still today, a lot of the common practice. And to your point, oftentimes when we think about blood sugar and including how it's taught in the curriculum, it really is kind of within the context of diabetes, which is to say blatant dysfunction so far along that things have gone really off track. in general, we have so many things in place that suggest to people that they don't need to make changes when in fact they're in the window of opportunity to make changes. For example, using cutoffs for lab markers where we say, okay, for a fasting glucose, if you are 98, totally everything is fine. Keep doing what you're doing. But if you're 101, you have prediabetes and there's a problem. That doesn't make sense. It's all a spectrum. Right. So this is a long way of saying I started really realizing that the calculus just didn't add up in terms of what I was being told about my health, but what I could see in the labs was actually happening and what I felt in my body. I had all of the symptoms of prediabetes. I was having energy crashes. I had all kinds of things going on that just didn't feel like I was in my full state of health. So I actually started doing basic research, essentially reading books, going online, trying to listen to different types of thought leaders and different sources of information. The internet was definitely very prolific at that point, but less so than it is now in terms of having tons of access to really high level knowledge. At that point, one of the leading voices, and still is a leading voice, but he was one of the only voices, was Rob Lustig. Mm-hmm. And I listened to his talk, as many people have, on blood sugar with so much attention. I listened to it so many times because finally I was hearing something that seemed like it made sense physiologically. And then I just went through all of these bizarre attempts to create some kind of methodology to follow. So like I said, I had glycemic index and glycemic load charts. I was trying to track what I was doing. I was getting really close to finger pricking just to see what was going on. And it was around that time that I was thinking about finally leaping into finger pricking that I signed up for trying to get a continuous glucose monitor. But it was a very hacked together approach. And I think that's one of the things that excites me about Levels is finally, and the work that you're doing, is finally there are really credible sources with good science, with practical, actionable steps you can take to get control over these things.
Definitely. Well, I think that's what's so empowering about knowing your own data. And what you guys are doing on the back end is with all of these users, you're able to do research studies around the information that you're gathering. And it's really exciting because when you look at small community-based studies or even studies with blood sugar dysregulation, a lot of times it's where people either have an autoimmune component or they're already with full-blown disease, type 2 diabetes. So we're seeing this in like healthy people. We're able to look at what's really happening in a healthy, active population. And I think that's what I'm so excited to talk about today. And we'll dive into all the different diagnoses like Alzheimer's and polycystic ovarian syndrome that people might not know are related to metabolic dysfunction. But can we talk about some of the research you guys are doing and some of the outcomes you're seeing, what you're trying to do on a larger scale at Levels?
I'm so excited about this because I think it reflects a shift from traditional clinical study research, which has a really important role, but it's very controlled and sterilized in some ways, to shifting to looking at, like you said, large populations and real world data, trying to notice patterns of what is happening in people's bodies as they live their normal lives in the real world, as they go about their jobs and maybe not eating perfectly or going through phases where they exercise and then don't exercise. You just get such a much more rich look at health than you do in this traditional clinical study setting. So we've actually just launched a very large IRB approved study that will be the first study of its kind of this size to try to understand glucose patterns in non-diabetic populations. And like you said, this really hasn't been done. And up to this point, we've been collecting a lot of information on this. We already have the largest existing database pairing continuous glucose monitoring data with food logging. But now we're really formalizing that in this very, very large study. And what we expect to understand is just much better, what is the baseline for blood sugar in healthy people or in people who are on the spectrum of metabolic dysfunction but haven't received a prediabetes or a diabetes diagnosis. And I think ultimately the goal is to have insights that people can apply to their own lives to move away from that pathway towards prediabetes and move more into full health. And so we've been observing all kinds of interesting things that haven't resulted in formalized results yet, but are just observations. And I think show the tip of the iceberg, so to speak, of the types of things we can uncover. And so looking at everything from, for example, the impacts of apple cider vinegar on food, or the impact of cooling starchy foods like potatoes before eating them so that you have more resistant starch, the impact of walking after a meal. these kinds of things that just really haven't been looked at this level. So we just kicked that off in a kind of more formalized way and really, really excited to see what the results of that are over the coming years.
Yeah. How long will the study be and when will you be releasing results on it?
That is a good question for our head of research, who is the formal overseer of the study, but it will be a multi-year study. And I expect that we will be releasing information as we learn it. And people can expect to see insights also in our product, where we're able to get closer and closer to personalization by, again, when you have such a large and diverse data set, we'll be better able to say as our expectation, okay, well, let's say you're a woman in your 50s and you exercise this much on average, and you've responded in this way to these foods in the first week of your experience. Okay, we can probably recommend to you that you will improve your metabolic health by doing these three things. Like that level of personalization would just be such a huge step forward in terms of managing blood sugar for people, again, non-diabetics. So I think that there will be formalized results released in the form of publications. There will also be results reflected in our product work and also reflected in all of the information that we put out into the world, our podcasts and our blogs. A big part of our mission is education. Even if someone never becomes a Levels member, we want this information to be available.
Yeah. Well, if someone is a Levels member and using a CGM, can you talk about what learnings they may have throughout the day and how and why their food is scored and what you guys are looking for, and maybe even diving into when they exercise, what they might see, or with caffeine, or if they eat their meals a little too close together or a snack and a meal too close together. What can people gather from this kind of information day to day?
It's pretty incredible the amount of variation between individuals and within an individual day to day in terms of what they're eating. So what people can expect to see is really a real-time window into how their body is experiencing the various inputs from the day, if we can call them that. And so primary input would be the food they're eating, but also to your point, inputs around what kind of sleep did they get? What kind of stress are they experiencing? What kind of exercise are they getting? So for example, in the mornings, we can take a hypothetical person. They might notice that when they wake up in the morning, their blood sugar is a little bit high. That might reflect that they have some insulin resistance going on, or it might reflect the dawn effect, which is simply that as the body wakes up in the morning, cortisol rises a little bit and we prepare for the day by having an increase in blood sugar. So right there at the beginning, wearing a CGM, you get some insight into how your body prepares you for the day. Then let's say you go and you eat your breakfast and you notice that your blood sugar spiked much higher than you thought. Maybe you had a breakfast of oatmeal. Oatmeal is one of those foods that I know you've talked about that people think is so healthy because of marketing primarily. But in fact, it's one of the largest blood sugar spikers. And so you might see in your own body that your blood sugar is spiking way up. And maybe you even feel that high start to happen. I think over time, people start to sense when their blood sugar is high. So I certainly now know that was the feeling I was feeling all those years ago every time I ate oatmeal.
Can we talk about what those symptoms might be for people?
It really varies. I think it's what I feel in my body is almost like a buzz, like a high, and in a way, I think I used to think it felt good. Kind of like that's what a sugar high is. So I think people have noticed when they eat cake or something, you get this happiness and this buzz, but then you start to feel a crash and a craving. So I think feeling a high and then a craving is one of the most common symptoms of blood sugar spikes and drops. A lot of people describe mood swings as part of this. Overall, just tiredness, kind of unexplainable tiredness where it feels like you're never rested. You're just on this treadmill of exhaustion. There's physiologic symptoms that people experience, especially over time. But for example, skin health, acne often reflects that something is going on with your metabolic health. Weight gain, and especially weight gain within the context of, for example, exercising a lot or calorie restriction or doing things that you're doing on purpose that you think should be managing your weight, but you're still gaining weight or you're not able to lose weight. Headaches, sleep disruption. A lot of people find they can't get high quality sleep when their blood sugar is out of control. So in my mind, almost every symptom that people experience likely has some potential link to blood sugar.
Yeah, I would say personally, just because I'm intimately in a relationship with my blood sugar, when I do have something that dysregulates blood sugar and I have a blood sugar spike that's more aggressive than normal for me, I do feel that buzzy feeling you feel, but an inability to concentrate. Like I feel frenetic and not focused. And that's something for me that just stands out. Like I can't work. Like it's too hard, which is funny because growing up, I was diagnosed with ADD as a child. And in hindsight, I think it was dysregulated blood sugar, because those feelings I feel as an adult when I eat a specific way.
Wow. And it's interesting because a lot of parents or people who spend time with children, that if you send a kid to a birthday party and they eat all the sugar and they come home, they're like wild. They will have meltdowns, all these things. And the reality is that that physiology that's happening in their body, it happens in adults too. And I think we've just normalized it and learned how to work around it. But so many of these things that we think of as just normal, unavoidable aspects of life, like you're describing, like inability to concentrate sometimes, I don't actually think they need to be part of our physiologic normal state. And so a lot of this is just reprogramming ourselves to be like, oh, actually, this is what I feel like off of sugar.
Right. And I think what hit home for me is just when I started diving into the kids' research and looking, there was a retention study with dysregulated blood sugar versus stable blood sugar, and looking at a processed food diet versus a whole food diet. And the children who were eating a more whole food diet and had regulated blood sugar had better retention 30 minutes after the lesson, statistically significantly better retention than the children who had dysregulated blood sugar. And it's, I feel like as a parent, you want to, like, yeah, of course, like, yeah, we want to celebrate. But it takes so much effort, and it takes so many boundaries to work to keep the sugar out of your house and to keep it to a minimum, and to like allow the kids to celebrate when they go to a birthday party, but to, load up on protein before, and, get them on the trampoline at the birthday party when they're there, like it's like a whole thing. It's a dog and pony show, but it is real. Now, more than ever, it's really important that we're voting with our pocketbook. I think we can look at every decision we make as a way to support brands that are focused on our planet's health and sustainability. And in the last year and a half, I've really tried to clean out my closet. And that's when I found Vuori. So Vuori is an athleisure brand. And if you've been at school drop-off, I think 1 out of every 4 moms are wearing their performance joggers because they're really, really comfortable and they come in amazing colors. But the reason why I love Vuori so much is because they're committed to offsetting 100% of their carbon footprint, and they're focused on sustainable materials. So not only are they really high quality, beautiful, and super comfortable, but they're really focused on a healthy planet. So if you are looking for a way to gift your family members something that they're going to love, but also support brands that are focused on sustainability, Vuori should be a brand that's on your radar. And if you haven't given their clothing a chance, I recommend their performance jogger and their daily legging. And if you have a hubby, their men's core short is awesome. But I also want to support you to do that. So you're going to receive 20% off your first order and free shipping for orders over $75, and you get free returns. So all you need to do is go to vuori.com/Kelley, and you can see all of the amazing options they have. That's vuori.com/Kelley, and Vuori is spelled VUORI and .com/Kelley. And the deal you're getting is 20% off your first order and free shipping for orders over $75. And they have a free returns policy. So you can't lose by giving them a try and just feeling how soft and luxurious these sustainable clothing options are for your athleisure wear. So let's talk. After that blood sugar, they may notice that their breakfast isn't working for them. For example, right. What else might come of the day and their food choices, and what Levels is able to provide them in regards to scoring, information, and tips?
Well, what typically happens when you start the day off with poor blood sugar is what you're describing, which is ultimately you probably have a crash and you probably feel that. And it's going to create cravings for another high carb, high sugar meal. And so typically people end up on this roller coaster all day of feeling hungry and cravings and never feeling satisfied and just spiking their blood sugar all day. So what Levels tries to do with the scoring is to help you see in an easy way what meals are working for your body. So meals will get scores, but also over the course of the day, how your metabolic health was doing. And we look at a few things, and we're constantly iterating on how to do the scoring to make it both as reflective of good health as possible, but also as motivating as possible, because the goal is not to create judgment or punishment. It's really to encourage people to understand and to learn about what works for their bodies. So we look at things like the amount of variability throughout the day, where we're looking for as kind of rolling hills more so than mountains and valleys in terms of your blood sugar. And then also looking at just what % of the day are you in what we deem to be the healthy or optimal blood sugar range versus outside of that. And that's really because what we're looking at is the overall strain on your body of the choices that you're making. If your blood sugar is constantly above that healthy range, then your body has to constantly pump out insulin, which, as you know, creates a whole cascade of other challenges for the body. And so what we do in our scoring is really just try to create a cumulative reflection of what's working and not working for you. And we highlight actually, okay, this breakfast meal worked really well for you. Or maybe this breakfast meal didn't work well for you. And here's some suggestions of swaps you can make that will be more blood sugar friendly. Or we'll suggest, okay, if your blood sugar is spiking, it might be a good time to try to go out for a little walk. So we try to do both overarching insights, but also insights in the moment so that as it's happening in real time, you're able to have the opportunity to make choices that might actually benefit you in that moment.
That's great. Can you give us insight into what the healthy range is and if Levels is seeing that go down or up among the healthy population?
So we, based on our medical advisors and our review of the literature, the healthy range that we recommend is to have blood sugar between 70 and 110. And within that, the goal is to, in general, have a relatively low baseline level of blood sugar. So for example, when you wake up in the morning, it's ideal to have blood sugar in the 70s to low 80s. And of course, there's a lot of personalization here. And then every time you eat a meal, our recommendation is to try to stay below 110 on the rise, and or also to try not to have more than a 25 to 30 point increase with any given meal. And I'll say my experience with this when I first started using Levels and had a continuous glucose monitor was it seemed almost impossible to achieve that. I couldn't believe that was the recommendation. Even with, I was eating oatmeal and I had switched to steel cut oats and had cut out some of the blueberries because I thought that would help. And I was spiking 40, 50 points, even though I was walking after the meal. I was really trying everything because I was certain that the steel cut oats were healthy. And I just couldn't understand what the problem was.
That wasn't the issue, Lauren.
Right, exactly, clearly. And so I think at first, what many people notice with this range is that it feels very tight. But as you get into a rhythm with your blood sugar and as you understand your body better, it actually becomes relatively comfortable, at least in my experience, to maintain that most of the time. And again, I think different people have different approaches to how strictly someone needs to stay in this range. My perspective is I try to stay there most of the time. And sometimes if I have a spike above that, I just try to get back on track. And I don't put a lot of weight on any one specific moment in my life.
You know what's so freeing about a CGM that I don't think people would realize is that information allows you to get back on track versus these strict diets, cleanses, goals, PDF eat, do not eat list, where if you fall off the wagon or you like fail on that, you feel like you need to be more restrictive and strict and you have no baseline other than the scale to tell you if something's working or not. And you're using a barometer that takes days to weeks to see results when your body could be morphing in so many different amazing ways, positively for your metabolic health, for your muscle mass, like changing your body composition for days to weeks, like I said, before you start seeing these arbitrary improvements, which is a scale versus say exactly what you said. You have these massive spike, you went to a party, you had the brownie, you ate the Halloween candy. What's so cool about that is one, it's motivating to see, okay, I woke up with an elevated fasting blood sugar. I'm not in the 70s or low 80s like you're talking about. I am in the high 90s. And that is detrimental to my health over the long term. But right now, it's not detrimental. I need to get it back down. And what we can do to do that, a fasted workout, a little fast, a protein-only breakfast where you're having, or Fab 4, you're having like scrambled eggs and veggies, or you're having a smoothie and you can see like a couple scores of a 10 and that blood sugar's back down, an early dinner, a good sleep, and you wake up the next morning back in the 70s or 80s. That's way more motivating than feeling like a failure and then feeling like a failure again and feeling like a failure again, when over the long term, what is happening is you're seeing that fasting blood sugar go up. And say like when people throw the towel in for the holidays, as we're coming up to the holidays or the whole holidays, it's like 3 or 4 months of time. And then January is really hard because you have elevated fasting blood sugar, you have insulin resistance, you haven't been moving your body, and it feels like climbing a mountain versus something that is attainable. So I have to say, like, sometimes more information people can feel like makes them more strict or obsessed, but actually I think this is so the opposite, because it's actually a health goal to have a healthy metabolism, and metabolic health is your future health, brain health, body health, organ health, you name it. So I'm glad you said that. I think people need to know there are a lot of videos online that say like CGMs like going to make you crazy or you shouldn't do them. And I just would say, in my experience with my clients, I've seen the exact opposite. Like I've seen them feel free from it.
I agree. And that's the thing that I think is interesting is ultimately, I think it actually creates freedom rather than restriction. And a lot of it in my mind is cutting through the confusion that's created in some cases purposely by marketing of the food industry that makes it very hard for us to know sometimes what actually are the right choices or not for our body. And so having that window actually allows me to say, you know what, this thing that might not work for somebody else, it actually works pretty well for me. But this other food that works really well for someone else actually doesn't work for me. And so when you approach these things, you just go in with a lot more knowledge and the opportunity to learn. Because like you said, I mean, I think, especially with holiday parties and these kinds of things, it's really interesting for me when I do decide, for example, to eat dessert or something, that I'm able to see what's happening on the monitor and I'm able to see how I feel in my body. And I can actually ask myself, do I like the way that I feel right now? Because I think before I didn't really make that distinction. It was more that I was drawn to the sweets. And of course, sugar is very addictive, as we know. And so you're in this addictive cycle, but you're really disconnected from your body. And I think the CGM can be helpful in kind of creating that link to say, the sensation that's happening now, I can also decide whether I like that or not. And that's separate from creating rules around food restriction.
Totally. One of the insights that I found personally that I've shared with my clients is that a lot of times, like after dinner, people want something sweet and they're like, not going to have it, not going to have it. And they sort of like decide, I'm not going to have it. And then maybe they are on their computer for an hour or they watch TV for an hour and then they go, I'm going to have it. And they ultimately end up having the sweet. And so what I've found and what I've seen in a couple of my client CGMs is that later sugar indulgence that's post and metabolism of a fully balanced macronutrient rich meal of protein, fat, and fiber is more dysregulating, eaten later, eaten alone, eaten right before bed, to their fasting blood sugar the next day and all the cravings that they'll have, instead of just saying, oh, at the end of every dinner, I finish it with a bite of chocolate and I have it to finish my meal. And so that's what I tell my clients. You want a piece of chocolate? Great. I just want you to have it with your and around your meal. And here are some options with lower sugar, but don't get in the mindset that you're never going to do something, because that always backfires into a binge that ultimately is more dysregulating to your blood sugar and worse for your metabolic health than just saying, hey, if I want it, I can have it, but I got to have it now.
Absolutely. Well, and I love your approach to these kinds of things because you're very practical, but also moving people towards health, which I think is such a difficult balance to have. And from a science perspective, one of the interesting things on late night eating is that at that point, you're starting to produce melatonin, which it ends up actually contributes to insulin resistant state in the body. So now you're having that chocolate at a time when both your body has decided it's not time to eat, and now you're eating. So that's confusing for the body, but also you're just less able to handle it. And of course, you're unlikely to move, and there's all these other things, but it's really interesting. And I've certainly been in that situation so many times. So no one is immune to it, but I love your approach for preparing essentially for it and saying it's okay. Like, these are not things we need to shame. These are just things we can strategize around.
Well, I like to be an open book. I've struggled on the couch wanting the chocolate in the fridge, and I just have to have a plan for it. And I have to have no shame and guilt around it. I just have to have a plan and an action. And that's where the insights on the CGM can be like, oh, well, I thought this little bite of like coconut ice cream was so bad for me, but I had it right after the meal with Bash at like 5:30 or 6 when we eat dinner with him. You know, there are things that I've done as a mom that have helped my metabolic health dramatically. And it just really, a lot of it has to do with eating earlier and calling it after that meal. So interesting. Well, let's talk about some other insights that someone might have. One of the things, speaking of that window, is you guys score meals in a specific hour range. So when I've noticed when I'm eating a meal and I log the meal, I scan my CGM, which also is really nice because I used to use a regular glucometer with myself and with other clients, and remembering to prick before your meal and 90 minutes after, 2 hours after it's a lot. and CGMs just are constantly taking your blood sugar. So you don't have to scan it. It's getting that information. I would say like every 6 hours, you have to scan it, but it's not every minute, right? So we get that information. Well, let's say I have a meal and then 90 minutes later, I have a snack. It won't score my first meal. Can you tell us a little bit why and what people should know about snacking in regards to metabolic health?
Yeah. So when it comes to scoring, like I said, we're doing a lot of iteration and our data science team is working on this. Our research team is working on this, but basically how to get the most accurate scoring possible, because when you think about it from the back end, we don't really know that you just had a meal and then you snacked. It can be very confusing to know when people start and end their meals. So we're actively working on that from a tech perspective. From a physiologic perspective, the challenge when you snack a lot is that basically your body is always processing glucose. And that's assuming that you're having snacks that are at least contain some carbs, but almost all snacks do. That means that the insulin that your body produces as the signal to move sugar out of your blood and into the cells is constantly being activated. And so essentially when you snack, and again, assuming that you're having somewhat traditional snacks, but even quote, healthy snacks will do this, your insulin levels are just elevated throughout the day. And unfortunately, what this means, depending on what your health goals are, is that one, insulin can be relatively inflammatory. So you're putting your body into a state of relative inflammation throughout the day. But also insulin is a signal to the body to store fat, to create fat. And this is actually a beautifully elegant system that the body has to protect itself from high blood sugar. So we should actually be thankful that insulin creates fat out of high blood sugar because it's helping us to avoid the toxicity of those elevated blood sugars. But what this means is that if you're always snacking, and so therefore you always have some glucose in the blood, and therefore you always have insulin, there is a signal in your body all day that says store fat. And the opposite of that is there's a signal saying do not burn fat. And so what this means is that you're unlikely to be able to use fat as a fuel source, which of course is important, for example, if you're interested in weight loss, but also just weight maintenance. And I think this is why, among the reasons why, it's become so clear that the calorie in, calorie out equation for weight management and weight loss isn't the full picture. So you can be in a calorie deficit and doing all kinds of things, but if your insulin is high, it is going to be very difficult to lose weight. And you see this kind of come to fruition, especially in conditions like PCOS, polycystic ovarian syndrome, where there is elevated insulin among other hormonal imbalance. And people often tell women with PCOS, well, the key is to lose weight, but it's very hard to lose weight. And so you end up in this cycle of challenge. And a lot of this has to do with just having elevated insulin levels throughout the day.
Definitely. So let's get into some of the disease states that can happen when your metabolic health takes a hit with elevated blood sugar. Well, a lot of us know type 2 diabetes, but what are other disease states that are an indication that there's blood sugar dysregulation or there have been years of blood sugar dysregulation?
I'm so glad that you mentioned that, because I think something that people don't realize is that typically we now understand people are having metabolic dysfunction for over 10 years before they receive a prediabetes diagnosis. So there's a long window of time in which impacts are occurring, and they're really across every body system. Since we were just talking about PCOS, we can dive into that a little bit. PCOS is a multi-system condition of hormone imbalance in reproductive age women that's actually so linked to metabolic health that in 2012, the NIH proposed its name be changed to metabolic reproductive syndrome. It is the leading cause of infertility in the US. It is very, very common. It's in about up to 1 in 4 women of reproductive age. And about 80% of women with PCOS also have insulin resistance. Seen another way, research has shown that about half of women with PCOS will develop type 2 diabetes by the time they're 40. And so you can just see this close interlinking between insulin resistance and hormonal imbalance. And really what's happening there, it's a very complex condition that researchers are still trying to understand. But one of the main mechanisms is that the insulin resistance that women are experiencing is signaling the ovaries through these high levels of insulin to create hormones, including androgens, or characteristically what we think of as male hormones. But of course, they're also present in the female body. But hormones like testosterone, which then create this cascade of downstream impacts and symptoms like difficulty with ovulation, hence the infertility, weight gain, acne, sometimes unwanted hair growth, all of these things that are happening because the ovaries are actually very, very sensitive to insulin. And so when insulin is elevated like that, the ovaries get very out of balance and the overall hormonal ecosystem happening in the woman's body gets very disrupted. So this is much, much more common than people think. And a lot of women are experiencing the symptoms, but haven't received a diagnosis. And so there's this very, very long period of time when there's confusion. And then even after diagnosis, unfortunately, in my opinion, and I have so much respect for my practicing clinician colleagues, but I think the way that we approach PCOS and many of the metabolic health linked conditions is not particularly responsive to the root cause. Rather, we're just treating symptoms, right? So we're exactly birth control. We're like, okay, well, it looks like things are out of whack, so we'll just override your natural hormones with birth control. And of course, that doesn't fix the root cause. It just masks it.
Yeah. And then unfortunately, when they get to an age where they do want to have children and they're taken off birth control and they're surprised that they can't get pregnant, it's that we never got to the root cause issue of these symptoms they were having at a very young age and maybe had years of blood sugar dysregulation, whereas getting a CGM or getting some insight into your blood sugar can give you the clues that, wow, maybe I have a thin frame, but I have reactive hypoglycemia and my blood sugar is out of control. I think that's also really interesting because I have had clients with PCOS with a low fasting blood sugar would have no idea that they're dysregulated all day long. And the minute you get them on a CGM and they're off their birth control and we get a real idea of their hormones, we can point to the fact that they've been dysregulated for so long. They can ask for an ultrasound. They can get into the nitty gritty to see if they're producing cysts, and then they know. And the hardest part too is like you go down the road of IVF or support to get pregnant. And then when you get pregnant, those symptoms crop back up again. Higher chance of gestational diabetes. Let's take a minute for today's sponsor, Hiya. Hiya is my boy's multivitamin, and I chose it because the majority of children's multivitamins on the market are using improper forms of vitamins. They're filled with 2 teaspoons of sugar, and a lot of times they're made with gummy junk. So when Hiya was created and pediatrician approved, I decided to give it a try. And here's why I love it. It's formulated with the help of nutrition experts, and it's pressed with 12 organic fruits and veggies, and then supercharged with 15 essential vitamins and minerals, including vitamin D, B12C, zinc, and folate. I'd like to point out that all the B vitamins are methylated and in their proper forms, which is something I really appreciate and look for in all multivitamins from kids to adults. But I love that these essential nutrients are really there to help support immunity, energy, brain function, mood, concentration, teeth, bones, and more. They're vegan, dairy-free, allergy-free, gelatin-free, nut-free, and everything else you can imagine free. And I just love that my kids remind me to eat it every single day. They're always asking for their chewies when they see the cabinet. When I open the smoothie cabinet, there they are, and they will reach for them. And so I worked out a special deal with Hiya for their best-selling children's multivitamin for you guys. You're going to receive 50% off your first order. And to claim this deal, you must go to hiyahealth.com/Kelley. This deal is not available on their regular website. So go to hiyahealth.com/Kelley, Kelley, and get your kids the full body nourishment they need to grow into healthy adults. Can we talk about pregnancy and metabolic health? PCOS or not, what's happening in the body? How does our metabolic health change? Why is blood sugar important?
Pregnancy provides such an interesting window into a woman's metabolic health, in my mind. And really what happens during pregnancy can set the course both for her and the baby in terms of metabolic health in the future. Insulin is a growth signal. And so insulin is actually really critical for the growth of the placenta, the growth of the fetus, and also preparation in the woman for the experience of pregnancy and postpartum. So for example, insulin is related to breast growth and preparing for breastfeeding. It is related to fat storage so that the mother has the nourishment she needs for this very demanding, energetic process of pregnancy. And women naturally become more insulin resistant as they move through their pregnancy. Unfortunately, though, sometimes the insulin levels are so high that the balance is lost. And that's when women start to move towards gestational diabetes, which impacts up to 10% of women in their pregnancies. And there's been a lot of research looking at basically what are the impacts for the mother and the baby of having insulin resistance during pregnancy. And there's quite a few studies now suggesting that, for example, women with insulin resistance, first of all, they give birth to larger babies, higher birth weight babies. And this makes sense intuitively because the baby is developing in an insulin-rich and probably glucose-rich environment. So there's a lot of growth signaling there. But that those babies born in that environment have, in one study, a 40% increased likelihood of having obesity and metabolic health challenges as teenagers. So there's long-term consequences of that for the baby. And then for the mother as well, we know that gestational diabetes increases the risk of developing diabetes down the road. And to your point, I think a lot of women go into pregnancy with no idea that they might already have some metabolic dysfunction happening. We know 9 out of 10 Americans have metabolic dysfunction. So the odds are that almost all of us begin pregnancy with that possibility. And then as they go into pregnancy, they start to discover this window opens up. And so I think it's a really interesting time. And unfortunately, the way that our medical system deals with this is still not particularly connected to root causes. We tend to just essentially treat it almost like we treat diabetes, which is to say you track your blood sugar and maybe you even start taking insulin if things are really off kilter with your blood sugar, but we're not getting to the heart of it, which is trying to create a foundation of metabolic health.
Oh, I want you to say that again louder. I get so frustrated. I have had clients with just gestational diabetes, and the handouts they've been given at their OB's office or at the hospital is about adding a cheese stick to a piece of toast or the bread that they have, and looking to hit a specific carbohydrate number per day and a specific protein and a specific fat number. And for me, it's like, I look at that and I go, we're all going to hit our carbohydrate intake, especially pregnant. That's what we're craving. It's more about how we're balancing those meals and sustaining ourselves between those meals so that we aren't constantly full of insulin and in a state of fast weight gain for ourselves and our child. Because as you just stated, your choices when you're pregnant impact your child's life, their future metabolic health. Like that is, I mean, it's heavy as a parent, especially when you're in the throes of maybe food aversions, cravings, not sleeping, toddlers, and going, yes, I do want that muffin at that coffee shop. But to remind yourself and to use the science as motivation to make those choices is so critical. And like you said, I mean, it's like a preview of what's to come. So if we're dealing with gestational diabetes in pregnancy, there's a likelihood that we're going to have that diabetes diagnosis later in life. And if anyone's listening, I think one of the best ways to balance your hormones and to prepare your body for pregnancy is to use a CGM. And if you can't afford a CGM or you can't get access to one, like get a regular glucometer for 30 or 40 bucks at CVS and start understanding what your fasting blood sugar is, and test yourself in the morning and test yourself after meals, and just generally get an idea, draw the curve on a piece of paper, understand where your hormones are at or where your blood sugar is at, because that is an indication of your hormone health, your fertility, your ability to balance blood sugar now and pregnant. Like one of the best things that you can do for yourself. It's so impactful. Oh, sorry, soapbox.
No, I completely agree with you. And I think something that needs more awareness is that some of these tests, like fasting glucose, if you're getting it once a year in your physician office, that does not give you a full picture of your metabolic health. And I think sometimes it is, well, not sometimes, almost all the time, it's suggested that if that one metric is normal, you have nothing to worry about. And that is simply not true for so many reasons. Among them, that you can have a normal fasting glucose for a very long time while experiencing metabolic dysfunction, because your body is brilliant. Your body is releasing insulin in order to get that fasting glucose into a normal range. And so one person might have a fasting glucose of 85, and they're requiring 2 units of insulin to get it there. And someone else might also have a fasting glucose of 85, and they require 20 units of insulin to get it there, 20 naturally produced units, not injected units. And so you have 2 people who a doctor would say are equally healthy, but in fact, one of them is living with very high insulin levels and is already experiencing, in all likelihood, insulin resistance. And so unfortunately, I think this is true throughout the lifespan, but especially for women, they go into pregnancy very likely, potentially already experiencing challenges and have no idea. And in fact, they've been told the opposite, which is everything's fine. And that's also true after pregnancy. We know that the risk of developing diabetes is higher, and there is almost no follow-up care for most women postpartum. There's just these once in a while tests where they say everything is fine. But again, unless you have a continuous glucose monitor, or you're doing tracking on your own, or you're really getting a full picture of different types of metabolic labs, not just one fasting glucose or A1C, you really don't know. And so you're missing this window of time in which you can make even small changes that could have a really big difference.
Definitely. I feel like as women, we are lucky because we have our 5th vital sign. I mean, we have menstruation that allows for us to understand if we're fertile, and if, like, what are our symptoms, and are we ovulating? Do we have PCOS? But I think it comes down to even some of the symptoms that you have just for a regular, a menstruating woman, not looking to be pregnant, but some of the signs associated with periods and PMS can actually indicate potential metabolic dysfunction. Can you talk a little bit about that?
The menstrual cycle is so interesting because the research is really emerging here. And unfortunately, this is because in general, there hasn't been a lot of research focused on women.
Leave us in the trenches.
Exactly. It's really amazing how few research dollars have gone into this and how many studies on basic physiology only included male subjects, either humans or animals. It's really, really shocking. So hopefully that's changing. And there is some really interesting insights coming out. But what we already know is that insulin resistance or insulin sensitivity changes throughout the menstrual cycle. And so you are not the same body, for example, in the first half of the cycle that you are in the second half of the cycle. And specifically, it looks like the dominant signal during the first half of the cycle is estrogen. Estrogen is linked to insulin sensitivity. So it's expected that women during that time would have a higher resilience to carb and sugar loads. Not that we should be doing that, but that our bodies are primed to handle that in a more resilient way. Versus after ovulation in the second half of the cycle, the predominant signal is progesterone, and that is linked to insulin resistance. And so that is probably associated with less of resilience to eating carbs. And yet at the same time, as you mentioned, our craving for carbs increases during that second half, during the luteal phase of our menstrual cycle. There was an interesting observational study that looked at eating patterns in women just in their day-to-day lives during the second half of their cycle. And what it observed is that on average, women eat 260% more refined carbs during that second part of the cycle than the first part. So there's this interesting dichotomy where we're craving more carbs, we're eating more carbs, but our bodies are less set up to handle that. And I think, again, as we wait for research to continue to evolve, but just having the awareness that that's happening, and to your point, being able to have a plan and to strategize to say, okay, I know this is the phase I'm in. I can feel the cravings happening. I know that my body's less able to tolerate them. So these are the things I'm going to do to feel satisfied, to nourish my body, and also to try to protect my body so that I can feel as healthy as possible. And I think we're getting a lot of clues that many of these PMS symptoms that we think of are, of course, very hormonally linked, but are also influenced by blood sugar. And again, the exact ties there aren't fully known, but my expectation is we will know more with every passing year, and we'll know more as we just observe it in our own bodies. And this is one reason I'm so excited about Levels doing real world, large scale research. You can imagine when you have continuous glucose monitoring data on tens of thousands of women going through different cycles, and you're just understanding the food they're eating and how they feel and what's going on with their blood sugar, the insights that we can gain will just be so interesting and helpful.
Oh, I'm using natural cycles in my Aura ring. Like I have so many ideas for Levels to pair with natural cycles and the Aura ring, and like to get that insight to be able to say like, oh, you had a dysregulated night of sleep and look at your blood sugar today. Oh, you're in the second half of your menstruation, your menstrual cycle. Oh, look at your blood sugar. And there's so many applications and ways to get like even deeper into the research. That's my wish list.
I would love to get your collaboration, because the other side of it is optimization around windows of opportunity during the menstrual cycle to push our bodies in different ways. So for example, one of our advisors, Sarah Gottfried, has highlighted days 9 through 14, which is essentially when estrogen is peaking and testosterone is actually also peaking, as a time when we are likely to find it, one, easier to stress our bodies, but also potentially to get more benefit out of it. So for example, doing things like intermittent fasting, if someone is interested in that during that time, strength training workouts, just hard workouts in general, perhaps experimenting with the keto diet. These kinds of things are much easier to do in all likelihood during certain parts of the cycle. And again, she's highlighted that phase as one. And my expectation is that as we get more data from more women, we will understand other areas of opportunity, and it will be really fascinating and also helpful.
Oh, so exciting. I don't want to fast forward time because my kids are little and this is fun for me, but I would love to just have those. There's so much to learn, and our kids are going to have access to so much more than we ever had, and be able to identify diseases earlier and prevent them and really take control over their health instead of having to take around a glycemic load chart and try to figure it out.
Absolutely.
So in regards to the Levels data set, can we talk a little bit about some of the biggest offenders? I mean, for you personally, it was oatmeal. And what's your relationship with oatmeal now? What are some of the big offenders? How can people have a good relationship with the biggest offenders? How do you negotiate with yourself or allow yourself certain things knowing there are big offenders?
I have a nostalgic and sentimental relationship with oatmeal. I don't eat oatmeal anymore. I just found that no matter what I did, it didn't work for my body. I tried cutting down the amount of oatmeal, steel cut oats. I added protein and fat, which are strategies that you talk about that I think are really powerful. And in the end, it didn't work for me. It led to a lot of cravings. After I would get hungry after I ate it like an hour later, and then I would crave something sweet, and it just didn't work. So I switched to different breakfast foods. I love doing what I used to do with oatmeal, but now with chia seeds and basil seeds, which isn't for everybody, but I find it works really well for me. And I think actually oatmeal is one of the largest offenders we see in our data set. It leads to often spikes as high as 60 points, which is really shocking considering the marketing. A lot of the oatmeal containers have hearts on the containers.
Oh. Newsflash, they just paid for that heart.
Right? Exactly. And as a side note, I mean, I think this is one of the reasons why I'm so passionate about levels is part of the goal is that as we pull that confusion away, there will be pressure on the food industry to change their marketing because more and more people will be empowered with their own data about their own bodies. But oatmeal is really our top offender in terms of surprising offenders. And that's not just oatmeal, but also oat milk, oat flour. Anything involving oats tends to spike people. Mm-hmm. Another common one is grapes. Grapes have, on average, depending on the variety of grape, they can have 15 to 20 grams of sugar per cup. Again, depending on what you're eating and how you're eating it. In general, people eat grapes on their own and they eat them as a snack. So which is to say typically on an empty stomach. We find that that is one of the largest blood sugar offenders in our data set. There are ways to work with that. For example, adding protein, fat, other sources of fiber, or eating them, like you said, after a meal. That will help with the blood sugar spike dramatically. And or doing some exercise. So doing some walking right after eating them, or even maybe while eating them, and then just trying to reduce quantity. I think one of the trade-offs with all of these things is nutrition and blood sugar, right? Like the sole goal of our lives is not to have a flat blood sugar curve. We could do that by drinking oil. And of course, that's not what we're going for. And so I always try to have some sense of, okay, well, maybe if a fruit has a lot of nutrition, I personally think grapes are not the best trade-off, but some people love them. So each person needs to figure out their own strategy. And then one that's a really big offender in our data set is sushi. Yeah. Sushi tends to really, really spike people out. And that's due to a variety of things. One is the rice, just the carb load, but also there's often a lot of added sugar. And that's not just in the rice, but also in the sauces. And so it tends to be very, very difficult metabolically. And I think, unfortunately, it's also a food that people pick on purpose because they think it's healthy. So they'll opt to eat sushi over something else, specifically as a healthy choice. And that's one that we see come up a lot.
Yeah, I was surprised at how rocked my blood sugar is. Like, it's just totally dysregulated after sushi. And I kind of lean now towards, well, Chris doesn't love sushi, so that makes my life a little bit easier. Because if I'm doing sushi, it's like with a girlfriend, or I'm taking Sebastian being like, you need to expand your palate. But it's few and far between now that we're not in the heart of Los Angeles. And so that's okay. So I don't feel bad if it's an occasional thing, but yeah, leaning more towards the sashimi and all the things that are higher in protein, the less sauce is definitely key. Exactly. Anything else that you think we should be aware of?
When it comes to food or when it comes to metabolic health more generally?
No, I was just seeing if there's any more offenders we should know about, or those are the biggest ones.
Those are the biggest ones. There's some other that are not super surprising. A lot of the foods in Asian restaurants, like the noodle dishes, tend to be really difficult, both the noodles and also the sauce. Mm-hmm. Some of the quote healthy snacks like acai bowls are just laden with sugar. So there's those things that you would expect. But I think it's really, like I said, I mean, I think the thing in my mind is just, it's not that people can't eat these. It's more that if you're going to have something like sushi that you know will spike you out, you might just ask yourself if you want to use your glucose on that. Or maybe if you're okay with having glucose spike, you're like, you know what? I love this other sweet and I get so much enjoyment out of it that I'm going to opt for that instead of the sushi. And so it's really just having the consciousness to be able to choose and use it accordingly.
Totally. Make a choice, not a cheat. We don't need to make things, we don't need to make things cheat meals. It's just, it's like informed consent. It's what you're giving people. So I feel like that was like 15 minutes. I could talk to you forever because I obviously love blood sugar and metabolic health. So I guess we'll end the podcast that way. What do you think are some things that people can do to improve their metabolic health? Like why, we've talked about why it's so critically important, but someone's dealing with conditions like insulin resistance, that stubborn weight gain, and calorie restriction, overworking out, and still having problems, like what can they be doing to support their metabolic health?
The most important thing is breaking the cycle of high insulin levels. And there's a variety of ways to do that. So I think the first one is diet. And it's what we've been discussing, being conscious about what kind of blood sugar load you're creating and how frequently you're creating that. And so really just trying to give your body times of rest from having to deal with blood sugar. So that doesn't mean you have to be radical and never eat any carb. It's more being conscious of saying, okay, I had a high carb meal. Now I'm going to let my body rest the rest of the day, which means eating things that are geared more towards fat and protein and fiber. And then, like you said, maybe having an early dinner and then giving my body rest overnight so that I reset for the next day. I think that's really helpful. Movement is just so powerful. I know we talk about it all the time, but I think any amount of movement makes a dramatic impact on insulin resistance and metabolic health, including literally just standing up instead of sitting down after a meal. Like those things, they sound so silly, but they make a really big difference to move. And I've seen it on my own continuous glucose monitor. The difference of just standing up and moving around versus sitting can be pretty dramatic. So I think movement can't be underestimated. Sleep is so important for setting the body. And of course, life happens and we don't always get to control our sleep. But when we don't get good sleep, just being conscious that next day, our bodies are more fragile when it comes to blood sugar, and trying to take extra care, despite the fact that we're probably going to have more cravings than we normally would. So again, living in that zone of understanding that there's tensions in two different directions in terms of the body. And then stress management. I think one of the most amazing things that I've seen on continuous glucose monitoring and that I've had friends experience is the visible impact of stressful situations. One of my close friends had a fight with her partner and she was wearing a continuous glucose monitor, and her blood sugar spiked higher during that fight than it did for any food she eats. And it stayed high until they resolved the fight. And as soon as they resolved it, it came right back down into normal range. I think that's just one example of the interlinking of stress, metabolic health, and how it interplays with everything else going on in our lives. So my overall approach is just try to do what we can. No one, I think, can optimize everything all the time. And so it's just pulling on different tools as they're available to us.
Definitely. Well, speaking of tools, Levels is a tool. I find it so helpful for my clients. I believe in your mission so much. You know, I'm an investor of Levels. I am intricately invested personally, emotionally. Like I want my clients to have it. I want my community to have access to it. I'm so glad you guys don't have a wait list anymore. So thankful for that. So if you've been waiting for the wait list, like Lauren was, and like I was at one point, you no longer have a wait list. I always think that a month of data is really informative, but you guys are being amazing and actually offering any of our community 2 additional months. If you can get 3 months of Level CGM under your belt, first of all, you may become addicted because it's very fun if you like games to gamify and try to improve your scores. But it's also so powerful in whatever goal you want: acne, weight loss, body composition, sleep. Managing blood sugar gives you all the body composition goal, that vitality that you want at the end of the day, and you're doing it in the most healthful way, in a non-forced, restrictive way, in a very informed way that will change the way you eat for the rest of your life. So if you guys want those additional free months, thank you to Casey and Lauren for supporting my community. You can use levels.link/Kelley, which used to help you guys skip the wait list, but now there's no wait list. So now we're giving bonuses away, which is so awesome. Lauren, this was so fun as always. Like, you're a wealth of information, and it's just so exciting to see what research and outcomes we'll see from everyone using Levels. For people that have Levels, how can they continue to support Levels and the gathering of information? Do we overshare? What do we do here? How can we help?
Everyone is helping by participating in the research that we've been describing. So really, it's a community effort and a team effort. And then I would say just continuing to spread the word, sharing with friends and family about metabolic health and how blood sugar has impacted your life. I think one of the biggest changes we need is just for metabolic health to come into conversations around dinner tables and with friends, and start to move some of these things away from being radical, like you're describing in terms of birthday parties and these things, and becoming the norm, where people sit down for a meal to share and they say, let's have these foods because it makes us feel most alive. rather than being the one person at the table who's saying, oh, I'm going to order something different, right? Like, right. I think the more we can just bring this into conversation, the more that everyone can benefit, and not just Levels members, but anyone. Right. Anyone who is struggling with their health or wants to feel differently than they're feeling right now. So just talking about it and sharing with friends and spreading the knowledge.
It does. It gives people power behind their voice to say, that doesn't work for me. And if you need to see the data, I'll show you my app. But you can have that conversation without having to overshare or make up an excuse or have a long diatribe around like why you can't eat a certain way. And it does. Whatever you do in your life, if you have enough power behind your voice, enough motivation, you motivate everyone around you instead of having to be that lone wolf who feels left out and alienated. Like, you really can be a change maker. And I know that Levels has helped so many people do that. And so I'm all for health tech. I'm very excited about it, obviously. But if you need that motivation, if you want the information, definitely check out the show notes, head to the link, get a few extra months, go check out Levels podcast. Yeah, where can we follow along with you and everything that Levels is doing so that we can stay up to date?
Levels has an amazing blog. I'm biased, but I think that we put out really, really high quality content at levelshealth.com, and you can find the blog from there. We also do podcasts where you were graciously a guest of ours, and people can find that in wherever they find their podcasts. You can follow Levels on Instagram at Levels. And then I also have a channel at Dr. Kelley-Chew where I do things like go into grocery stores and look for culprits of high blood sugar and just other types of kind of knowledge-based posts. So just spreading the word and getting as many people involved as possible.
Love it. Share that information so everyone can change their lives. Well, Absolutely. Thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it. And we'll talk to you soon.
Sounds great. And thank you for the work that you do. You're having such a huge impact on people's health. And I really just admire it and appreciate it.
Oh, thanks. Well, you guys know where to find Levels in the show notes, or head to levels.link/Kelley. Get 2 additional free months with your membership. Thank you for listening to Be Well by Kelley. Please subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Learn more at BeWellByKelley.com and follow me on Instagram at BeWellByKelley. I would love if you picked up my books, Body Love and Body Love Every Day. They're sold on Amazon and at all major booksellers.